So we are the middle panel. We are the fourth panel of 7 in the event. And I don't think that as being the hump panel. We are at the fulcrum where all the questions that people have been asking for the last 3 panels, we're going to try and answer them in the next hour and a half about how do you do this. We've heard a lot of questions about why we should, what questions we need to debate, but how do we do that? And we're going to come down to thinking about words and statutes and signatures on contracts and all around the procurement process. So from developing solicitations and tenders to turning those into requests for proposals, to turning those into procurement contracts, the parties that are involved in that, and how do you integrate in non-price criteria into those offshore wind solicitations? How do you take the scientific discussions that we've been having, the policy concerns, and how do you bring that together into enforceable contract mechanisms? And we have an excellent panel assembled to do that. We are sort of combining European and American experience. So we have three panelists from the Netherlands. We have Ruud de Bruijne, who is the tendering manager for the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, who will be joining us remotely, as will Egbert Jansen, who is team manager contracting, construction, and operations for Pondera, which is a consulting agency. Remco van Sliedregt, there we go, legal counsel and regulatory for Boskalis, which does contracting work. McClellan Press, who is senior project manager at NYSERDA, overseeing out of the solicitation process. Michael Richards, who is a commissioner at the Maryland Public Service Commission, so seeing procurement contracts, seeing solicitations as they're getting there approved and getting issued. And then finally, Marty Heinze, who is at BOEM and working on developing the auctions and running the auctions that create the opportunities to sign these contracts, issue these solicitations. So we will, as my moderator's prerogative, I'm going to take time and talk about myself. One thing a law professor never does is the opportunity to talk. We don't run out of words, we only run out of time. But I will be on time for this. So we're actually doing some research projects that I do want to point out to Trish. We're doing it in concert with the Nature Conservancy. We'll go to the, I'm not sure where I'm advancing my slides off of. I have 2 of them. There we go. All right, so we have a joint project with Vermont Law and Graduate School. I have 4 of my students here, Jack, Kelsey, Kira, and Irvin. They're all going to wave right now. When we think about, this is just, again, my law professor prerogative, at some point in time, whether if you're a developer, you're in government, you're going to need a lawyer. These are the people who will be in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. They're interested in the type of things that you're doing, and they want to help you do your work. And the people in front of them are the Roger Williams Law School students. I don't know them by name, but I got to meet some of them last night. Again, if you have a chance at a networking break to talk to them and think about how might you give them an internship opportunity, what things do you want them to know? Because that's the type of thing that, if we're going to do workforce development, we need to workforce develop our lawyers as well. So feel free to talk to me about that. I'll take advantage and say you can do the same with Julia as well. So back to the project. So we are working on a project investigating state and federal regulatory structures for the potential to incorporate non-price criteria into offshore wind solicitations and evaluations. The report's coming out soon. Some of the key findings: words matter. We're going to use terms like mitigation in statute, or we're using terms like, are we seeking environmental benefits? For a lawyer, that's a big change. It's the type of thing where you can leverage that and develop policy. Mandates matter when we're coming to what state agencies have to do, what state public utility commissions have to do. What are they dictated? They are creatures of statute and they follow those. So if we don't have the right words in place and the right mandates in place, we might not getting the results that we want. Purposeful results come from purposeful actions, and we need purposeful words to drive those. Finally, process matters. Actors and actions, be aware of each state is different. I think that's one of the things we'll learn today, is that our Netherlands colleagues are always interested to understand this term of federalism and how the states get all this power to do things to the United States. Who are the actors? What actions can they take? It differs in each state, and it's important to understand that structure. What they're procuring, is it energy or environmental attributes? Also important. And how specific are they in what they want for their objectives that they want to achieve? And if all of that interests you, we have a webinar on Thursday, June 8th, that will be co-hosted between the Institute for Energy and the Environment, my home, and the Nature Conservancy. Everyone's here who shared their email address will get an invite to come to that webinar. And here you can learn more about the report. You'll get a copy of the report, which will be available in the first week of June. We'd love to get you to the webinar and hear your feedback on it and think about how we can turn that into action. So with that, I will turn it over. We have a recorded presentation from Ruud. We will play that and begin to hear from our different panelists. And we are trying to reserve as much time as possible for Q&A between the panelists and from you guys as well to hear about what you're interested in.
Good morning. My name is Ruud de Bruijne, talking to you from the Netherlands. And before I start my presentation, let me just show you where the Netherlands is located. On this map, you see a very small country, and that is the Netherlands, and also known about his success in the deployment of offshore wind energy. I will dive into that during this presentation, but you have to bear in mind that the conditions for offshore wind energy in the Netherlands are very, very good. We have a strong supply chain, we have excellent ports, a good wind resource, easy soil conditions, etc. And that is one of the reasons why our government has introduced a roadmap for the deployment of offshore wind energy, which is quite ambitious. And I will focus a bit on the projects to be realized before 2030, and that is already a challenge. And on the next slide, let me just show you how these tenders are organized in the Netherlands. Now, before we issue a tender, the government has already done the full consenting of the site. Our national transmission system operator, TenneT, is already working on the grid connection and has made the commissioning date of the platform where the wind turbines can be connected is already known, and all the site investigations have been carried out already. So the tenderer can just focus on his design of a wind farm and submit a bid for this tender. On the next slide, you will see some more details how this consenting is done. It's done in two phases actually, and the first phase is that the government takes an official decision about the permit condition. This decision is also subject to an environmental impact assessment, and then in the second phase, the winner of the tender receives a permit, but the permit says just you have to comply to the conditions given in the wind farm site decision. On the next slide, you see how the grid connection is organized. Our national TSO is responsible for the grid at sea. When the tender starts, the commissioning date of their high voltage platforms is already known. TenneT works with two standardized platforms, AC platforms of 700 megawatts, and for the sites further out of the coast, DC platforms of 2 gigawatt each. You'll see an overview of all the site investigations undertaken before the tender starts. Now, I won't go into detail at this moment, but it's really a comprehensive set of data, including geophysical, geotechnical data, and a 2-year Med-Ocean campaign. I will show you something about our next tender. Our next tender is in a wind farm site called IJmuiden-Ver. We have two sites there, Alpha and Beta, both sites capable to where a 2 gigawatt platform of 2 gigawatt wind farm can be built, and TenneT is going to build 2 gigawatt platforms in the site. The draft tender is just issued, and on the next slide you see again how it is done. So the consenting is available. The wind farm site conditions will become available before we start the tender. The platform is there. The site investigations have already been undertaken. You see how the tender is organized. In the tender we work with a number of requirements related to the technical feasibility, the economic feasibility, and the financial feasibility of the bid. Every applicant has to meet these requirements. If you don't, you're out. But usually all the bids are in line with the requirements. So then it comes to ranking, and for this tender we work with a comparative assessment which exists of a financial bid with a maximum of $50 million with which you can earn 0 to 60 points. You may of course bid more money, but that won't raise your number of points, and with a number of qualitative criteria. And with the qualitative criteria you can receive 400 points. Those qualitative criteria are mentioned on this slide. So we have 2 sites, 2 gigawatt each. There are a number of qualitative criteria related to both sites, and then one site is on system integration and the other one is on ecology. Why ecology and system integration? Because these are 2 constraints in the further outroll of offshore wind energy, and with these qualitative criteria, the developers are going to contribute to overwin those constraints. That's the whole idea behind it. After the tender is awarded, within 4 weeks, we want to be sure that the wind farm is really going to be built. Therefore, the winner has to provide a bank guarantee, $220 million for each site, and you have to reimburse the cost we have made for the site investigations, and that counts up to around $45 million. That's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take your questions and discussions during the next couple of minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruud. Ruud will be joining us for the online Q&A, so that was recorded, but he will be here live for the online Q&A. We will now go to Egbert, who is also joining us online, but live in person.
Advisory. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm the head of the advisory group contracting within Pondera. Next slide, please. Pondera is a consultancy firm only focusing on renewable energy development. We are a consultant, but also an engineer, and also in some cases we are an investor. We operate globally, and we have offices in Europe and in Asia, but more and more we also get requests from the US. And we operate since 2007. Currently we are with 70 experts, and in 2007 the first offshore wind farms were developed in the Netherlands, and the existing tender system as we know it today was not there yet. So we saw the industry and the tender system maturing together with our clients. Next slide, please. When we take a look at the services we provide, and thank you, Ruud, for the introduction, we see a change of clients through the development phase of offshore wind farms. We start in the planning and development phase in advising the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy, together with the Dutch TSO, the grid operator TenneT. After that, the tender and auctioning period starts, and then we advise developers and we help them in designing and of the wind farm and in the bid preparations. And after that, of course, we can also assist in the project delivery, in designing, procurement, and construction management. And all these phases, during all these phases, contracting is part of the consultancy service we provide. Next slide, please. Before we dive into how a winning bid is prepared by developers, it's important to know a little bit about the climate, the investment climate in which the developers are preparing their winning bid. Of course, they want the winning bid. And the investments are relatively low if you compare it to unregulated wind farm development. And that is because of what Ruud explained about that the ministry takes up the cost for all site assessments, etc., up to the permitting. But what we also see is that there is low certainty up to the award decision. So we see the red line increasing, which is the development cost from the moment that the tendering starts. And that can be a period of 12 months prior to submitting of the bids. So the developers are developing tender teams consisting of 20 to 40 experts, and they are preparing the tender, investing multiple millions of euros to prepare the winning bid. So in the middle, in the avocado seat, as I call it, it's very interesting area because there's a high competition, low certainty, and high investments. And this is also the area where Pondera can add a lot of value. Next slide, please. So how do we add such a value? That is mainly by giving our expertise and knowledge on a strategic level in assessing the award criteria up to implementing within the design all kinds of measures to make sure that the developers are preparing a bid that meets the requirements of the criteria of the tender. It takes too long to go through them one by one, but blue and bold are the most relevant contributors to success rate of developers. And it's interesting, next slide please, to take a look at the steps that the tenderers are taking. So the developers start with scrutinizing the tender criteria. I also heard it saying by Mark James already in the beginning, words matter. So it really starts with scrutinizing the tender criteria and evaluation of the draft criteria. And in Holland, we have this unique situation that between the release of the final criteria and the draft criteria, there is a consultation period that the developers are consulted and also have discussions with the ministry about the draft criteria, all with the aim to make it as clear and transparent as possible. Once the final criteria are released and we know about the differentiators, the qualitative criteria, as Ruud mentioned them, we know how we can draft a storyline. We implement the lessons learned from earlier tenders, and we create measures and opportunities to implement in the design. We perform feasibility assessments on technologies, and we design a dissemination method. So all the knowledge gathered in the winning tender also need to be disseminated. And the developers, of course, want to disseminate the knowledge, but not lose their competitive edge in the next round. The next step is to engage the market, and all these steps can be taken simultaneously to some extent. We engage partners and we finalize the tender teams, and the tender teams mostly are a combination of technology providers, scientists, consultants, suppliers, and contractors. And after the tender teams are assembled, we can start the preparation of the tender. We manage the work package, we perform studies and technology assessments, and we perform tender checks, tender compliance checks with the tender criteria, and we start the bid writing. Next slide, please. So if we take a look at the example of the differentiator ecology, it is interesting to see that, of course, risks are determined, but also opportunities. And when you talk about net positive impact, if one of the qualitative criteria is to create net positive impact, it is interesting to focus on opportunities. Of course, you have to mitigate risks, but it's also interesting to focus on opportunities. Next slide, please. But that's easier said than done. As you can see, it is easy to come up with technical solutions to mitigate risks. For example, for collisions, it is in the last design, we saw the distance being increased between wind turbines. Of course, there's an effect on the energy yield output, but this also allows birds to migrate through the wind farm. We see start-stop systems coming up with bird detection radars. So it is easy to mitigate that risk with technology and technology innovations. For distribution of invasive species, we see work method statements being created. For vibrations and underwater noise, we see, of course, the famous bubble curtains, but also slow start of the works. And in the last tender, Eneco introduced a silent pile driving technology. And for electromagnetic fields, cable burial can be a solution or coverage. So it is possible to include the market and market innovations to come up with risk mitigations. For reinforcement of the ecosystem and the use of opportunities, it is harder to come up with exploitation methods of the opportunities. And the reason is that knowledge is the limiting factor in a holistic approach and determining the real impact of measures and exploitation methods of opportunities. And here it also becomes very relevant. What are the tender criteria? What are the words of the tender criteria? So developers always take a look at what is the award methodology. Do I receive points for innovation? Do I increase my winning chances with risk mitigation, or by knowledge gap reduction, or by creating net positive impact? One last consideration we see is that the geographical area matters. If measures only can be taken inside the wind site, then the possibilities are limited. But if the area can be wider, then there are more possibilities. I hope this provides some insights of how developers are preparing for the winning bid, and thank you for your attention.
And next up is Remco.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, also for introducing me and for your very brave action to actually try and pronounce my last name. So that's, I really want to say, anyone who wants to talk to me, just call me Remco, because it's kind of, I kind of get a bit of a guilty feeling when I see the agony on people's faces and they try to pronounce my last name. So my name is Remco van Sliedregt. I work as an in-house legal counsel within Boskalis Offshore Energy. First question then is Boskalis who? Because it's not necessarily a household name yet in the US. As a company, we are a leading dredging and marine contractor working all over the world. We have quite a large fleet of vessels which can do all kinds of scopes of work. Quite a big revenue, and we basically have our headquarters in the Netherlands, but since last year we have our main US office, which used to be in Houston for the oil and gas market, but these days there's clearly a much larger focus on the renewables market, the offshore wind market here on the East Coast. So my colleague Jamie will be in a later panel, who is managing the new Providence office, which is growing quite rapidly, to prepare for this summer when we're really kicking off with the first project on the East Coast, where we'll be installing foundations, and several projects will be following in the coming 3 years. So we're quite happy to be in the US, and hopefully it will be a great time to work here. Maybe you will see, okay, well, you may have not have heard of the company, but you may have been aware of this container vessel that was stuck in the Suez Canal. Well, that was also one of our divisions, our salvage divisions, organized the pull out of that and sort of the opening up again of the Suez Canal. What I was actually trying to do in this talk, and I actually sort of had to be convinced by Julia and Tricia that I could have some contribution to this, because I'm obviously not a biodiversity expert. I'm not an expert on how it works in the US in terms of regulatory regimes and how you tender your projects. So I had to be convinced, okay, maybe I can make a contribution. What my idea is of this talk is to sort of make a little bit of a comparison between how it works in Holland, which I'm fairly familiar with, and how it works in the US, which I'm a little bit familiar with, so I have to be corrected, but that's fine. And also to focus a little bit on the pros and cons of actually using non-financial criteria in tenders, and what does it mean, what are the risks there, what are the good things about it, what are maybe the risks of it, and in the end, is it a good thing, a wise thing to do or not? And that isn't actually not an answer for me, not a question for me to answer, but that's a question for you as the US people who do developing these tenders to actually answer that question. Like, I just want to, I'm not going to rehearse the whole talk that Ruud just gave, but just to highlight a few things about the Dutch tenders, how they work. It's not a tender for a lease, it's a tender for a permit, which makes a bit of a difference, not necessarily all that much, but just to be aware of it, it's a permit to build it, but you don't actually have any property rights to the site, any lease sites to it. It's not an auction, and there's no more multiple rounds of bidding. It's just one round of bidding. You submit one bid with a financial bid, but also a comprehensive bid on all kinds of other non-financial criteria. It's only for the offshore wind side. Like Ruud explained, the whole grid connection up to and including the offshore substation is being built by TenneT, the offshore grid operator, which also means that TenneT actually has a binding commissioning date for that substation, and if they are late, you have an entitlement as a developer to damage compensation, so you get compensated for the fact that TenneT is late in delivering that substation. Another difference in how it works in Holland is that the developer in the end is responsible for selling the electricity that the wind farm generates. So it's not like you have to go to a public service commission and see where you can, which state, whatever entity is going to buy from you the whole the production and of the wind site. And we have gone through a development in Holland, just to be aware of it, because Egbert mentioned it in his talk that in the early projects there was no tender system at all. There were just some existing permits and developers built those wind farms offshore. But at some point in 2014, about-ish, the government decided that future wind farms that would be tendered through a tender process, and that started with the first round which were called the Borselen wind site rounds in 2017. Which was really just a sort of the old situation where wind farms still required subsidy, because without a subsidy they would not be built. So the award criterion was, award to the lowest subsidy that you required. But that has moved on, and as the market developed and the first subsidy-free wind farms were built, and then all of a sudden developers are actually willing to pay for the right to build a wind farm. That changed to the highest score on financial and non-financial criteria that we see now in the current tenders. Yeah, comparing that to the US offshore wind tenders, as far as I know about it, there's what is a bit of difficulty for me to grasp is how you have different tender processes in different stages of the development. So there's the BOEM process to tender the lease via an auction, as it works now. But later on, or even earlier, I think it's later on, but you'll have to correct me there. There's PPA tenders for the offtake of the electricity, and only after the lease tender does the real EIA start and the permit process. So there's quite a lengthy process at the moment that the developer has already actually forked out quite a huge sum for that lease. So that sounds to me like quite a risky situation, but maybe that's something that developers can give their perspective on. And here it is, the export cables remain in responsibility of the wind farm owner, which is also a difference. Like I said, in Holland it's the offshore grid operator, the government entity that does that. Yeah, so what I did is just highlight a few things that I noticed that I'm thinking, yeah, there's quite a difference between how the two systems work. Yeah, in Holland, the permit conditions that you have to comply with as a developer are known at the time of tender, so there's not much of a surprise to be had there, and you can actually, sort of build within your bid on those conditions. Yeah, in the US it's quite, yes, I've noticed that some permit conditions may be known, or at least generally known, but in general they still have to be developed, and the whole assessment has to be done of the site and of the ecology and everything behind it. So it could be quite a challenge also, and that's what the question that I actually have is that actually then create an uncertainty whether actually can deliver on certain promises that you make when it comes to ecology. One thing to be aware of is that how things are organized in Holland, in the Netherlands, is very much also influenced by the fact that we are, in Europe, we have this European Union procurement law, which is quite strict, quite formal. It does not apply to these tenders, but it does have an influence on how the Dutch government runs these tenders. It means that they really want to stick to, sticking with the general procurement principles of non-discrimination, of equal treatment, transparency, proportionality. It also means that because there is an expectation from the market that the government will stick to those principles and they will abide to their own rules and really be transparent in their decisions, that there is a risk of complaints and litigation against the award decision. And of course, there's not much of a risk if the criterion is only price. But as soon as you start getting in less objective, more subjective criteria, you get into an area where there is room and scope for litigation. So that is something to be aware of. And also, I think that what I've heard is that it's actually already has been considered here and seen as a risk in the US as well. So that's actually that question mark that I have. How much of a litigation risk do you perceive here in the US? As I understand it, there's not a formal procurement law that you are bound to, but there may be principles you have to adhere to anyway, and that may actually create this risk. Maybe to kind of give also a perspective from how it, in the Netherlands it usually is seen by developers and contractors, is that the big question that's actually usually first on the table is, okay, what do you actually want to achieve with your litigation? Just think of it like a developer who has become second in a tender. He's angry. He's like, well, they didn't assess our bid right. We got far too little points on this, so we want to do something about it. Can we start an action? Can we file a complaint? And then the first question is, yeah, well, what do you want to achieve here? And then that is actually a good question, because usually when you end up in these processes in the Netherlands, basically the most you can achieve is that the judge will give you a ruling saying, okay, yeah, it didn't go very well, and there was some mistakes made by the government, but yeah, so we, yeah, no, like in the worst case, they will say, yeah, okay, so I'll have to annul this whole tender. It has to be, it's not the right decision, but the result then is that the whole process has to be done all over again. It's very rare that a judge will say, okay, yeah, it didn't go right, so number two will now win the project. It just never happens. It has to be really, it must have been a really messy process if that happens. So in general, the only result you can actually get as a developer is just you have to go reform the whole tender team and again make 10 million euros of costs just to redevelop a whole new bid in a new process. So that is something that is usually holding back too much litigation in that respect. So that's actually a question that I have also, like what would the outcome be in the US situation? Would a judge be willing to actually award the project to the number two, or is it also the same kind of result that we see in Holland, that you just have to do it all over again? Yeah, on ecology, that's definitely not my topic, so I'm not going to dwell on that long, but I wanted to just highlight two things, is that in Holland, and I think that's something more for Ruud de Bruijne to explain, where the Dutch government has an interest in what the policy principles are behind it, but I think it's quite clear that North Sea is basically considered as an underwater desert. In the previous panel, we have already heard how, for example, in the past there were huge oyster banks, and it's just nothing left of it now. So yeah, that's a big reason for the Dutch government to actually do something about it in many ways. Yeah, I don't know. I've heard some things just now, and in the previous panel. So maybe in the US, it's not such a huge policy concern, but that's not for me to know. One thing to be aware of, because here fisheries are quite an important stakeholder, quite an important thing to consider, is that in Holland that's not much of a topic for the simple reason that fishing is not allowed within Dutch wind farms, which actually, of course, creates a lot of noise from the fisheries because they're saying, yeah, we're basically losing all our fishing grounds in the North Sea because of these wind farms. So there are talks going on, and Ruud will probably know more about this. But in what situations and in what ways could maybe fishing be allowed within the wind farms, but that's at the moment not the case. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of highlight and finish with a few pros and cons. Okay, what is a pro for adding ecological criteria? Well, I think it's always good to have an early focus on ecological benefits. Nothing wrong with that. That's a very simple statement. Maybe you should also use every available avenue to really use to increase and enhance ecology, biodiversity. I think one good effect is that basically when you do that, all the bidders will at least have to deliver a certain market standard minimum, so that it cannot be a laggard. If you're a laggard, you're not going to win. You just really have to get up to a certain level to even start competing for those tenders. And I have the idea that that should move up in quality through time. So it brings all the market players out there on the offshore wind market up to the level of the most proactive developers such as Ørsted that are out there. And then it's good to be aware, obviously, that the bidder is not forming a 40 or 50 people team and spending 10 million euros or dollars on an offshore wind tender if he doesn't want to win it. So the biggest goal is to win that tender by getting a far higher score than the competitors. So that does actually mean that you really do have to look very carefully at those award criteria and make sure that if you include those, if you find those non-financial criteria important, they really have to carry a lot of weight in that situation. And that's also then a question mark, okay, how do you then deliver on the promise? What do you actually ask from the bidders? Do you ask for concrete measures, or do you ask for more like plans or whatever? And how do you measure that? What do you consider binding? That's actually things really to consider in that situation. Yeah, and a few cons that I could think of, it could be, you can say that adding, sort of tagging on these criteria to a tender is maybe a bit convoluted. Why wouldn't you use other ways to do it? One thing to be aware of, you need to make sure that there is a level playing field, so that if there's information that is only available to certain parties and that is relevant for that tender, you have to make sure that it's available to all the competing developers. So another thing is that I think that's also been talked about the metrics, about how do you actually score the certain solutions that are offered. Do you need a track record or not? If it's about concrete measures, how do you score plans? Yeah, it's quite clear that you really want to have a predictable process and a predictable outcome if possible. So just be clear on how you actually score the different solutions that you're getting. And like I said, there is a risk of litigation if you move from one criterion that is very objective, price, to several more subjective criteria. Maybe good to highlight, and maybe there's something that Ruud and Egbert can also talk about more, is that in Holland there is usually a fairly intensive pre-tender market consultation, basically going out to the market asking, okay, we're thinking of setting up the next tender in this way. What are your comments? What do you think of it? Do you have ideas about it for improvement? And that usually, that at least sort of brings in the market and brings in the people who have to start bidding on it, and it helps also clarifying the mutual expectations, just to, and that's actually a way to mitigate the whole litigation risk in the end. And just want to quickly end, but Jamie and another panel is going to hopefully tell a little bit more about what we do in terms of ecology and biodiversity kind of projects. I wanted to highlight, first of all, the Marker Water project, because it's a really good example of how in the Netherlands we managed to achieve a sort of win-win situation. within the Markermeer, the IJsselmeer, which is really a dammed off inland sea, inland lake, quite a big lake, which was dammed off in the past because they wanted to build a new airport in it. Well, that never materialized. So it stayed a lake, but it was at some point just a big, green, globby kind of water in there. It wasn't much in terms of much life in there. The idea was then to dredge that and then that lake to a certain depth, and then use that mud and sand to create several new islands in that lake. And that turned out to be a really great success, because the idea is that the water quality improves so that the fish benefit, but also you create new island habitats and new feeding grounds for migrating birds, which Holland is really on a migration route at a big feeding station for migrating birds. And what you've seen is, it's amazing how in like 2 or 3 years after this has only been, I think, laid like 2 or 3 years ago, and even right now it's all just green and filled with birds, and it's just really quite a success. And we've been talking about the oyster reefs that used to be in the North Sea, and that we would like to get back. Boskalis is also involved in a consortium for achieving that. By using biodegradable materials as a sort of a base layer to allow the oysters to grow on. And the good news, it's actually right now in the stage of being deployed in one of the existing wind farms, which is actually, when you looked at the map earlier, so on the old oyster grounds north of Holland. So hopefully that will kick off a good process there. And actually wanted to show this picture, but more. That it seems that sometimes these projects have quite an ambition, because in the middle picture you see sort of what looks like a whale trying to get into this coastal zone. It's actually on an industrial canal, but it's creating a new nature kind of beach kind of area with the artificial reefs in front of it to break the waves, but also offer so it has the benefit of breaking the waves of passing ships, but also offering a habitat for all kinds of life underwater. And the last one that I wanted to say is how that's just trying to point out to you how Rhode Island has really been a pioneer in this artificial reef creation. Something I wanted to end this off with. So you're quite ahead of the rest of the nation. That's good for you. Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is McClellan Press. I am a senior project manager for NYSERDA in the environmental research program. And the purpose of our program is really to provide and support the science in order to inform the energy policy of New York State. I also am the chair of the New York State Offshore Wind Environmental Technical Working Group. Many of the members are here at this meeting. It is a forum that includes developers, scientists, ENGOs, state and federal regulators, and they come together to discuss, help us prioritize research needs, develop guidance, promote collaboration and communication across sectors, and then also to our broader networks to try to get information about offshore wind and the environment out to other folks. And so the results of that work and those conversations really help support and inform New York State decision making. Wrong one. Okay. The state has a mandate to achieve 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. However, to achieve the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act requirements for 85% reduction in emissions below 1990 levels by 2050 and 100% zero emission electricity by 2040, we think that at least 16 gigawatts of offshore wind may be necessary. I'm not going to get into some of the state work to develop offshore wind, but we've gone through one master planning process and we have just kicked off a second master planning process, and I'm happy to talk about that at a later time. Under several offshore wind orders from the New York State Public Service Commission, NYSERDA is authorized to procure offshore wind energy credits. And as Mark said, words are important, so I am going to paraphrase some of the Commission's orders to us to give you an idea of our solicitation process, but I'm really just going to focus on the environmental aspects of that, but there are a whole range of other considerations that the Commission takes into account and that NYSERDA plans for. So NYSERDA is to continue to work with stakeholders, including the state's offshore wind technical working groups, to develop procurement approaches that can enhance the design and performance of offshore wind projects, mitigate those project impacts while preserving the economic and environmental benefits. The offshore wind order requires NYSERDA to advance the role of environmental and fisheries mitigation plans with best management practices established by the technical working groups. And as words are important, best management practices is a very loaded term, but we use that very loosely, I think, in the order. The Commission recognized the efforts of the technical working groups in helping to build understanding between diverse stakeholders and to identify and develop best management practices that define basic standards for offshore wind development. So the inclusion of best management practices was deemed appropriate for inclusion in future rounds of procurement as identified by the technical working groups. And at this point in the order, the Commission had declined to take a prescriptive approach to the solicitation process, giving NYSERDA the flexibility to incorporate best management practices into consideration when structuring both the solicitation and evaluating bids as it deemed appropriate based on prior experience. So it gives NYSERDA quite a level of flexibility in both writing the solicitation and evaluating the proposals that come in. Oh, I went too far, huh? So NYSERDA currently has, or New York State currently has about 4,300 megawatts in active development. New York has 4 contracts through 2 solicitation processes in 2018 and 2020. New York 3 closed earlier this year, and it is expected that a minimum of 2,000 megawatts will be awarded later this year. Through those iterative solicitation processes, we try to incorporate lessons learned and stakeholder feedback each time. Okay, so I think hopefully through those other things you realize that we're trying to solicit more than electrons in our solicitation process. I'm just going to talk about some of the notable inclusions in our contract commitments. They include commitments to fisheries compensation, participation in those technical working groups, support for regional scale monitoring of wildlife and key commercial fish stocks at $10,000 per megawatt. So that in the last procurement raised about $25 million. Site and environmental data transparency, so that needs to be made public in a timely manner. Membership in regional science organizations is a requirement of the proposers. And then we also included noise mitigation requirements and noise attenuation monitoring for the first time. And so we use that solicitation process to outline some of the contracting requirements, but we also look at some of those components through the non-price criteria. We evaluate proposals based on 70% on offer price, 20% on economic benefits to New York State, and 10% on viability. And viability takes into consideration a series of factors that demonstrate whether proposed projects can reasonably be expected to be in service by the COD and operating through the contract term. So there's a pretty wide range of criteria that are included in that 10%, including environmental and fisheries mitigation plans, but a whole suite of other things are included. And if anyone wants to take a deeper dive into the solicitation, it's very complex, but all of the materials are up on the NYSERDA website, and there are presentations that kind of outline the different criteria that are included. And I think that is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I believe we have Michael joining us on line right now. There he is.
Yes, here I am. Can you hear me and can you see me?
We can do both of those. Welcome, Chris.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, and thank you again for the invitation to join you this morning for your conference, and just for your interest in Maryland's offshore wind program. I believe most of the audience is probably very aware of many of Maryland's progressive climate change and clean energy policies, but these are an important driver of our offshore wind program. And it's really important to note that offshore wind is an important component for us in achieving these aggressive, these goals. Now, I understand the theme of this conference really is on making sure offshore wind development is done right and is careful to protect our natural resources and marine habitat. And for that reason, the Maryland legislature, the Maryland legislature has specifically required us at the Public Service Commission to consider a number of state objectives in our selection of offshore wind developers. And that one of those includes environmental protections. So I understand this panel interest is on our selection process. There are generally just two ways that states can advance and financially support offshore wind projects. There's the fixed rate agreements or utility cost recovery. Fixed rate prices are determined through competitive bidding through either a power purchase agreement or, in the case of Maryland, an offshore wind renewable energy credit. And then for those states that have the utilities directly procure and own offshore wind generation, those utilities may fund the cost of the projects through normal utility rate making processes at their state utility commissions. The specifics are ultimately determined by the regulatory agency through a rate making process. Now, Maryland is taking the first approach of PPA through awarding of ORECs because, one, we are a restructured state and we rely on PJM for transmission and our resource adequacy. And two, we don't own or control the wind energy areas. And so we must rely on BOEM to authorize and permit offshore wind projects, both the construction and its operation. So ORECs enables a state like Maryland to purchase its preferred clean energy resources and to work directly with developers to advance large energy projects like offshore wind. So I know that there's the interest is again on our process, and it's important to note that the process for Maryland, we are depending on a competitive process. So our program began in 2013 with the passage of the Maryland Offshore Energy Act, which was the first round, and that started the first round of offshore wind procurement for the state through a carve-out under our state's renewable portfolio standard. Then in 2019, the Clean Energy Jobs Act created the second round of offshore wind procurement for Maryland. And these statutes contained a number of selection and evaluation criteria that we at the Commission are required to consider before awarding ORECs to a potential developer. First and foremost, the cost impacts on customers is a high concern to our legislature and to our state's policies. And there is a cap not to exceed $190 a megawatt hour, which equates to about $1.50 on impact on an average customer's electric bill in a month. We also went through a process of really evaluating the positives for net economic development in state, for the environment, and health benefits for Marylanders. We also set small business goals. We have a preference in state for union labor, and we look at that in a proposal. We have high goals for minority and diverse supplier and contractors as part of these projects. We also expect negotiations for local community benefit agreements. We also want a thorough evaluation on the siting and project feasibility in the applications. And of course, we want to specifically know how the project will help Maryland meet its RPS. The legislature also gave us at the commission the requirement to consider other, as we deemed, important criteria. And so we did get into some areas where we wanted to look at the impact on local businesses, particularly in the case of our ocean community, Ocean City, and also looking at ways we can enhance the environmental benefits of these projects. So the Commission issued a request for applications for both rounds 1 and 2, and upon receiving applications, we opened evidentiary proceedings. The evidentiary proceedings included public comment hearings and hearings And it enabled witnesses on both sides, pro and con for wind energy, to participate and submit a testimony for the record. All public documents are available on the Commission's website, and the proceedings are viewable on Commission's YouTube channel. So the Commission made its decision for winning projects based on the factors that I listed, and also on the corresponding cost-benefit analysis, and that were submitted during the evidentiary proceedings. So in total, to date, the Commission has approved over 2,000 megawatts of capacity, and the anticipated direct in-state benefits of over $1 billion, and we expect around 10,000 new jobs between all 4 of the approved projects. Many may be aware that the Maryland legislature just recently increased the offshore wind goal to 8,500 megawatts, and that's based on the expectation of using the entire wind energy areas off the coast of Maryland and Delaware, and also on the expectation that BOEM will be opening soon new wind energy areas off the mid-Atlantic coast. The new law will largely continue the process we used in the first 4 stages, but we are looking now to enhance the state's role in transmission planning and engaging either directly with RTO or looking at other options. And this really goes to the state's concerns about the insufficient attention being paid to offshore wind by PJM and some of the other RTOs. We also are looking at other ways to, mitigate customer impacts by the state being directly a customer for the offshore wind. So a lot of exciting things happening in Maryland. We hope that we will begin to see some of those turbines spinning off our coast by 2026. And with that, again, I thank you for allowing me to be a part of your conference.
Thank you, and Marty will bring us home.
Thank you. So I think most people in this room are familiar with the federalism. We've heard from a couple states. Remco sort of covered with his the Netherlands perspective of our federalism and how it compares, and that does create a lot of challenges. And there is some duplication as described in the state procurements and what BOEM requires. Overlap, hopefully as much consistency, but there are some differences. And I'd like to quickly respond to Remco's question of what is our concern, what is our, when we set up the auction, and it is definitely litigation risk. That is first and foremost in our minds. So my name is Marty Heinze. I'm with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We're the lead agency responsible for leasing submerged public lands, and I've been asked to speak about the possibility that BOEM could offer lease bidding credits for net marine gain efforts when auctioning offshore leases. BOEM's authority to offer bidding credits through a multi-factor auction is granted under the OCS Lands Act, and Ted Bowling showed almost an identical slide yesterday. The law requires BOEM to balance expeditious and orderly development with other aspects such as safety, protection of the environment, a fair return to the public, and prevention of interference with reasonable uses of the high seas, including fisheries and navigation. BOEM has offered or is proposing to offer bidding credits as a non-cash component when auctioning offshore wind leases. The Biden administration is currently prioritizing bidding credits for the offshore wind supply chain, workforce development, and compensatory mitigation for the fishing industry. Each of these initiatives has a direct link to the OCS Lands Act. A robust domestic supply chain will promote the development of offshore wind and support expeditious and orderly energy development. Workforce training supports offshore workers' safety, and a fishing compensatory mitigation fund or community benefit agreement compensates for potential loss or interference with reasonable uses of the ocean. In the most recent Gulf of Mexico proposed sale, which the comment period closes next Tuesday, BOEM is proposing to offer a 20% bidding credit for developing the domestic supply chain and/or workforce training, and a 10% credit for a fishing compensatory mitigation fund. And the focus on the fishing community, as I think has been alluded to most, BOEM goes through an extensive deconflicting process. There's a lot of areas that are simply, we call them constraints, using the NCOS modeling language from NOAA. NASA, Wallops Island, Cape Canaveral, they have big drop zones. They don't want stuff there. The military likes to fly planes over the ocean where they're not going to hit anything. If you have national parks, of which there are a lot of lighthouses, national historic monuments, if you put offshore wind turbines out there, they affect the view shed, and there's Section 106. So there's a lot of deconfliction done already. The fishing community is the area that isn't considered a constraint. So that is a high priority for compensation. In advance of a lease sale, a company submits a conceptual strategy outlining how they will meet the objectives of the bidding credit. BOEM evaluates the credit proposals on a pass-fail basis. So this is different than the Netherlands, and maybe we'll get into this in the Q&A, why we've chosen a pass-fail basis rather than a qualitative ranking. Compliance and enforcement provisions for the bidding credits apply later in the lease development process. To balance their receipt of a fair return and maintain equitable competition, BOEM is currently offering bidding credits of no more than 25% of the total bid. If you listen to this slide, you add 10 and 20, it's more than 25. But it's because of the way we calculate the bidding credit. We call this solicitor math for all you lawyers. BOEM cannot offer a discount off of the high bid. We have to essentially calculate the bidding credit off the cash component. So this is the contorted math. And so a 30% bidding credit is actually just over a 23% credit the way most people think about it. So we're not at the 25%. A 33.333 would exactly max out at the 25%, but that is sort of what BOEM would like to keep. We'd like to, the percentage of bidding credits is being designed to maintain the cash of at least 75% of the total bid. This maintains the balance between Congress's intent to direct wind energy revenues to the general fund, while also using bidding incentives to further OCS Lands Act goals. BOEM does not currently believe we have authority to enforce net positive impact right now under NEPA. It remains to be seen whether BOEM could offer a bidding credit for a net positive impact or no net loss policy. If offered, it would most likely be formulated to require a contribution of the bidding credit amount to marine net gain efforts. This is similar to, this would be designed consistent, which was mentioned by several speakers yesterday, that we would simply require a contribution into a fund for something like this, and it would not be required, unlikely to be required, that it would have to focus on the project area. The closest OCS Lands Act factor that could be authorized is protection of the environment, obviously. For BOEM to offer a bidding credit for net positive biodiversity efforts, there will need to be a strong case that adverse impacts to the marine environment from offshore wind require actions beyond existing mitigations. BOEM already addresses environmental impacts through its offshore wind plans, NEPA analysis, and subsequent approvals. And the mitigation hierarchy has been discussed frequently. The record of decision for approved offshore wind projects include environmental and other mitigations. There's been mention, and we just saw the European and some state policies include environmental factors for biodiversity net gain in awards or power purchase agreements. Any non-price factors will have trade-offs. If biodiversity net gain provisions are required through competitive offtake agreements, there will be factors certain to increase the cost of electricity for ratepayers. So the next question is whether the cost of non-price factors is worth the benefit. This last slide illustrates Atlantic state offtake prices. This is developed from NREL, and they've worked to normalize the offtake prices from the awards, and I think this slide was done in 2020. If you look at the comparison between Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey, I think it's quite illustrative. Massachusetts in purple considered price components in their procurements, and they have some of the lowest levelized prices that their ratepayers will be paying. New Jersey's non-price factors received the greatest weight and resulted in the highest offtake prices, higher than New York. Other things, if you notice, the small projects, South Fork, Maryland, are much higher. So Maryland sort of hit the double whammy. They had both a lot of non-price components and small projects. And you notice that with the size of these circles, diamonds, economies of scale are very important for price. Thank you.
I had one question about some of the pre-development work in the examples that were provided, and kind of how that may have shifted the cost criteria versus some of the other components, and if doing all of that pre-development work really de-risked the process to the extent that there was less variability in the price offers, and if that is why it could be used as a smaller component of the overall criteria.
So I'm not sure if anyone from on the Netherlands side wants to talk about the role of the government in doing all of the assessment work in advance and then providing that data to the developers. How does that change the process or the developers go through in developing their bids? Is it a narrowing factor? I think that's the...
No, I don't know exactly what you mean, but you have to understand that the whole process we have developed in deploying offshore wind in the Netherlands is a result of co-creation between the government and the industry, how to do it. So we had when we started with this rollout, these discussions, and it resulted in the situation where we are now, that the government is de-risking the development of offshore wind energy by taking care of the consenting, taking care of the grid connection, and taking care of the preliminary site investigations.
And does that de-risking see a shift in any of the types of bids that are being received, or the?
Well, the first we have had now 7 tenders in a row. The first 2 tenders were still with subsidy available, subsidy in the form of a one-sided CFD. But we saw already in the second tender that those bids were very close to the then by market price of electricity. So from that moment, we started to tender without subsidy, and now we even added let's say non-financial criteria and also a financial bid. That's the situation where we are now.
Yeah, what we see is that the financial bid is set at a certain value, and you have to see that as a check in the box. So the developers, they all, yeah, Ruud, I see you, but in the end, if you want to get awarded with the full number of points for the financial bid, you have to give that bid, of course. And the rest is incentivized by the award criteria for the non-price criteria. So I hope this explains a bit. Ruud, maybe if you want to add to that, how does it impact the price?
Yeah, you're completely right when we talk about the previous tender we have organized in Hollandse Kustwest. That's correct, but every next tender we improve the system. And for the tender which is coming up right now, which I talked about in my presentation, the 2x2 gigawatt tender, there was a slight mistake in my presentation because I presented the financial bid as $50 million US, but that's annually. So you have to pay that every year in a permit with a lifetime of 35 years. So that's quite a lot of money. So we don't know yet if everybody sees that as a tick in the box. Yeah. The waging is relatively low. It's 50% of the total points you can earn. But on the other hand, in previous tenders, we have seen that if you want to win the tender, you have to see how to get the maximum points, and you don't want to lose any points. Another thing, what we have done in comparison with the previous non-financial criteria is made them much more objective. So it's much more clear what you can do and how many points that will be awarded with.
Thank you. I think Marty in his presentation talked about how BOEM evaluates those on a pass-fail basis. What happens in the Netherlands when in evaluating those qualitative criteria? How is that set up? Could you explain that?
Well, we usually put together a number of independent experts, and they give us an advice on the non-financial criteria. All the other criteria, requirements, etc., is done by ourselves. And then we come to an award decision, and as I said, we have now had 7 tenders in a row, and so far we have never had any serious litigation issues that went to court.
So, perhaps it's a partial answer to the litigation risk. Part of the answer is we could be in the U.S. As well, which might be a more litigative environment.
Yeah. Well, it helps a lot if you have a good cooperation with the industry. So that's what we are used to. So even the tenders itself, you can see that it's a kind of result of co-creation with the industry. So that limits the risk for litigation. And on the other hand, we have quite a roadmap, a rollout system, which requires that if you want to join the Dutch market, you have to be quite fast. When one tender is done, we already went to the next one. So there's no time for discussions in the courtroom, and we like to keep it that way.
That is a litigation risk management strategy as well. Yes. Keep them busy. It works for children
exactly.
Too. So I'm gonna ask one more question, and then I'm gonna let the audience jump in here. One of the things I talk about is I heard multiple people talk about this, was the input in the development of the solicitation. In Commissioner Richards talked about how they're evaluated, having an evidentiary hearing. So whether it's Kate or Commissioner Richards wants to talk about how when you begin the process and how getting input into determining what those qualitative criteria might be, what those non-price criteria are, and sort of how NYSERDA works and how the New York Public Service Commission is involved in setting what will become your final RFP and having that issued.
Well, for us, the Public Service Commission established the order to authorize NYSERDA to procure offshore energy credits, and there's a pretty wide amount of flexibility those orders around a number of different things. I didn't talk about some of the economic and supply chain drivers that are also in there, and there are kind of specific details in the different orders from the Commission on those things, but I can talk a little bit more about the environmental criteria. Starting before we started our offshore wind procurement process, we had an initial master planning process that identified some of the key issues in offshore wind development. It looked at, we did more than 20 studies on different offshore criteria that helped kind of inform our thinking around some of the priorities that we could incorporate into the solicitation process. And then the other big component of that has been stakeholder involvement and our ability to use the technical working groups. So we have an environmental and fisheries technical working group that help inform the mitigation plans that are required in our solicitations. And because we've done 3 now, at each time we're able to apply some of the lessons learned in between those processes to improve on what we're asking for, to go back to our technical working groups and other experts to try to inform the things that we're asking for and guidance around those things. So one of the areas that has developed over time has been the requirement for site and environmental data transparency. The idea was that we wanted the data that was collected at the projects to be available to the public, but we didn't have any guidance around what that actually meant. Where is it publicly available? On what timeframes is it publicly available? So we had to develop a guidance document on what those things meant and point to that in the solicitation to give the proposers an idea of what that criteria actually would include. And we're trying to do that as we go through to provide more guidance each time as we learn more from the previous processes.
Mark, yeah, thank you for that question. I would start, I think it was noted that Maryland, some of our 2 first projects were probably among the higher cost, but I would also note that Maryland was attempting at that point to be an early mover, and so that was early in the process. Our second round, we did see prices come down around to more the norm. But going back to that question, I think a lot of the criteria it came from our legislature. I mean, again, as I said, the environmental and the climate change goals were a big driver. But also there was a desire to see Maryland develop in this industry. We believe because of the location, our ports, our previous manufacturing facilities, that were no longer, I guess those sites were no longer in use, steel making. So those were all included, and we were very pleased that in the proposals, the developers are in fact developing and using vacant areas, unused areas of our ports, and reinvigorating some of our steel industry. And just the manufacturing facilities. So we count that as a success and an important part of our policy. And then also just the states giving, wanting to give priority to union labor, to try to engage diverse communities, make sure that those communities that have been adversely impacted environmentally gained some benefits from our program, and also benefit financially. So again, it's a whole package, both driven by the environment, but also it was an opportunity for Maryland to be seen as a leader and be a leader in the green economy, and in particularly this issue in this industry. Sorry.
Hi, Carl LeBeau with the Nature Conservancy in New York, and my question is for Martin. I'm just looking for clarification if what I heard from you was that because BOEM hasn't achieved that 25% maximum cap according to that special bath you put up, that it could be possible for commitment to contribute to a dedicated fund for, say, environmental restoration could be potential, and it wouldn't necessarily need to be evaluated on the merits of how that money would be spent. It would just be on the contribution amount. I'm just trying to clarify in my mind if that's what I heard.
Yes, that's a good synopsis. According to current policy, with our cap of 25%, there is some headroom to move up a little bit. So it's a policy call. I mean, the decision is made by political appointees, what they want to prioritize. Obviously, fishing has been a big priority. Jobs, supply chain, workforce training has been a big priority. If net marine gain is introduced into there, you know, I'm not going to presuppose how they're going to prioritize that, but I think your synopsis and summary is correct.
Sorry.
Hi, Amy Trice, Northeast Regional Ocean Council. Just if multi-factor bidding is maybe off the table, and I'm trying to think of like how do we drive this from a federal perspective, what about lease stipulations, and can we think about some of the work that maybe NYSERDA is doing at the federal level, integrating that at the federal level? So things like data transparency, engagement at a regional scale on science and monitoring, are those options as well?
I did mention this during my talk. BOEM does not currently believe we have the authority to enforce net positive impact right now under NEPA. So I would leave it to one of the lawyers to say that more definitively, but it appears right now it's unlikely.
Hi, I'm Michelle Matson with Army Corps of Engineers. I'm wondering, well, I have a couple questions. One, with all of the data that's being collected, is there a database that is, particularly like in the Netherlands or here, where all of this data is being compiled, the raw data, so that there is transparency, but also use by the scientific community, by other applicants, in a way to do things better over time with adaptive management? So that's my first question. And the second is, are the states or any of the applicants either voluntarily or required to meet with the regulatory and resource agencies prior to submitting applications for leases?
Let me answer the second question first. Yes, there's an extensive task force process that it was mentioned yesterday that includes federal agencies, state agencies, some local government officials, some key stakeholders, especially tribal representatives. So yes, prior to the lease, there is the task force process that for many states has, gone on 12, 13 years now. So yes, there are multiple efforts to consolidate. I believe the Nature Conservancy, I don't know if we got a lot of reps from that organization here, is one of the key geospatial aggregators of available data. I don't know if anyone else, someone from the Nature Conservancy can speak to those efforts.
I can speak to the data of a different side before handing it over to TNC. So with our requirement for data transparency for environmental and insight data, that was one of the things that we ran into is, okay, well, the developers are collecting this data for a number of different things, but then what do they do with it? Do they have to keep it somewhere? Like, what is the best use of it? And for many of the data sets, there are existing databases where it is probably most useful to turn it over to those. We funded a report that Kate can tell you more about from Biodiversity Research Institute on wildlife data standardization and sharing, and some of the maybe guiding principles around what is needed to be shared, potential databases where it could go, and timelines for what is actually like a reasonable time frame to make data public. But one of the things that they identified in that report is there are a number of data sets that are collected that don't have a great database to go into, and that's probably something that we should be thinking about with the amount of data that is coming in. Where should it go, and how do we communicate about where it is, and standardize some of the data collection criteria and reporting around it.
And I'll note that in Maryland, they actually require, Skipjack has every 6 months need to file a report with the commission on their documenting environmental impacts around their activities. So there are ways to build it into the process, but building it out or sharing it out is another challenge. Another question?
Yeah, thank you. Jocelyn Runbaum with the Nature Conservancy in Maine. So my question is about the multi-bidding factor criteria or the bidding credits, setting aside the net gain issue, just any of the bidding credits around labor or fisheries. I'm curious how the state procurement process and the requirements that might be in a solicitation for energy might impact the multi-factor and the bidding credits. So I guess, for instance, we're in Maine, we're thinking about labor agreements, we're thinking about fisheries mitigation plans, and yesterday we heard that bidding credits have to be additive and they can't be an obligation or a stipulation already. So hopefully this question is making sense. But curious how that interaction is going to play out between the state procurement processes and the bidding credits through the BOEM process.
I'm not 100% certain how it's going to play out. Obviously, the BOEM auction process precedes any state procurement of awards, so I think it would more fall upon the state to describe if they want to exclude or include bidding credit commitments, because the federal government will have written the lease, written the contract, and state actions are after that point. So I suspect that's how it'll work out, but I'm not certain. And as far as project labor agreements, we cannot, BOEM and the Department of the Interior cannot require them. The language is we encourage, and it's pretty strong encouraged language, but there is no penalty whatsoever if a developer would not have a project labor agreement.
And if I understand the question, just to be clear, the state of Maryland has no permitting authority or ability to grant an operating license to a project in the wind energy area. We do have, we'll have some, input on when any, the onshoring of transmission lines, interconnection lines, and some of the facilities that the company may build. But really what we're doing is we are going out for bid. We're saying we want to be a customer. We want to have the power purchase agreement. But part of the what goes into the awarding of the OREC, the Offshore Renewable Energy Credit, are certain conditions. And so we are depending on a competitive process. We're saying these are the things we're going to look at. And then through the evidentiary hearing and through an analysis by a consultant that we hire to look at all the bids, we then make a determination if any of the bids are compliant or in the best interest, the public interest. And then hopefully through the whole process, in fact, we experienced that. The original applications were submitted, and then in the evidentiary and I would say the competitive process, the bids got better. The proposals were improved. So at the end of the day, that's really all we have, is that ability to say, we want to be a customer. We will purchase the the output through the OREC, and these are, you know, if you want to be a potential provider, then these are the conditions that we would find most favorable.
And with that, we are at time. So I started off by saying words matter. So here are the words that I wrote down: conflict management, data transparency, public policy choices, NPC weighting, legal authority, and we'll keep talking to you. Look for the webinar on June 8th. We'll talk more about the work that we're doing, a little more depth, and all the words that do matter. And I appreciate you giving your time and the panel giving their expertise. It's been a wonderful conversation.